the thing that the sort of Trumpists have to acknowledge is that the movement in itself is not enough to win an election. The movement might get you 30, 40% of the vote. But is it going to be able to win a presidential election? It depends, I suppose, how Biden's administration goes. But I think at the moment, with the sort of current dynamics of American politics, I don't think sort of pure Trumpism wins.
Hello, today I'm talking to Freddy Gray, editor of the Spectator USA and deputy editor of the Spectator. We're going to talk everything US election, Trump, Biden, what's going on, and more. Freddie, how are you?
It's great to be with you.
Joe Biden is the president-elect, but his victory was far from the landslide that many predicted. The Republicans kept the Senate, which they were predicted to lose. They gained seats in the House of Representatives. You know, what happened?
Well, I mean, a lot of people would disagree with you, Billy, that the election is over. There's a lot of Trump people who are hanging on to the bitterest of ends. And I think there is still a lot of hope within certain parts of Trump world that they can find some way of overturning it. I would say, from my understanding, the White House is beginning to lose those hopes. I think there's a sort of growing acceptance that they've got away with it. That, you know, I think everybody in Trump world thinks that there is fraud on a massive scale. They just don't think they can prove it. So I think you are finally seeing a strange acceptance of it. And I have to say, I mean, I don't go for conspiracy theories. I try not to. And I think a lot of people were just confused by the result because you had this extraordinary night where it really did look like Trump was going to win until very, very late, early morning, sort of between 3 and 7 a.m. And then you had these huge surges of votes. And it is a little bit suspicious. I think a few of them are a bit suspicious. And I also think the whole mail-in system is strange, and it's led to a very unusual election. I mean, the fact that Joe Biden, who was not a good candidate, I think you can say objectively, he did not have a lot of energy behind him. He did not have a lot of enthusiasm behind him. The fact that he generated 78 million votes, almost 80 perhaps, according to some counts. And he has that's more than any other presidential candidate ever. The fact that that's happened is strange. And I think there are a lot of questions that need to be asked about the role big tech played in this election. And just how acceptable is mail-in balloting on that sort of scale as a democratic process?
The Republicans have apparently reshaped the electoral map in terms of demographics. So there was one infamous exit poll which put Trump having gained among every single group, black men, black women, Hispanic women, every single group apart from white men. Is the Republican Party becoming the party of the American multiracial working class, or is that just complete rubbish? And are there any parallels we can draw with this kind of realignment to the 2019 UK general election?
Interesting questions. I'd say on the first one, I think, yes, there definitely is the possibility of a sort of a working class rainbow coalition for the Republican Party in the future, and Trump has made that possible. However, there is another demographic where he where he did worse in 2020 than he did in 2016, and that's young people. He seems to have been down about 3 or 4 points with young people. And obviously going forward into the future, if you can't appeal to young people and you can't win them over, you're not going to win elections. And there's some interesting, we did a piece on Spectator USA about this recently, about how the Trump campaign, they had quite clever projects for appealing to various groups. They had quite clever outreach in the Latino community, in the Hispanic community, particularly in Florida. They had various drives to get out the African-American vote for them. That was slightly less successful, but nonetheless, it was also quite useful for convincing a lot of white voters that they weren't racist. But with young people, they just sort of outsourced it to Turning Point USA. And I don't know, I assume you know about Turning Point USA more than me. But I think it's fair to say that Turning Point did not do them a great service. This was not helped by the pandemic, of course, because college students were not on campus as much. So they weren't able to sort of drive out a youth effort. And I think they may look back on this and see that Turning Point did them no great favors at all. Yeah. So that's one. And what was the second question? Was how it compares with the. It's interesting. I mean, I suppose there is a sort of a working class anti-identity politics vote that is hardening, and it is class warfare in many ways. You know, you have the metropolitan elite in London. You equally have metropolitan elites in cities like New York, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Chicago, Seattle, well, you name it, every major American metropolis. And I mean, it's slightly different, I'd say, in Britain, because we have a more hardened class system. We have an older class system. So the sort of leap from Labour to Tory is perhaps more shocking in a way. Whereas in America, you actually have this hardening class system, and it's very interesting. It's a very interesting phase because, of course, America is founded specifically not to be a class system. It's all about equality and equality under the law. Mm. So you have, you have this interesting process where you have a class that feels left behind by globalization, and they are turning Republican, they are turning nationalist, and the obvious opportunity for the right is to try and capitalize on that. I think there's been perhaps a little too much said about what a big opportunity this is, because actually, if you think about Trumpism and Trump, it's hard to disassociate the crazy effect that Trump has on people, both for and against him, with sort of bigger shifts. I mean, I speak to a lot of Trumpists, and they always tell me, this movement is bigger than Trump. But I often think, well, who would really lead it without Trump? Who could actually bring that coalition together? And it might be his son, might be his daughter, but it's hard to see how you divorce the man from the phenomenon.
What do you make of the debates and the infighting that we've seen primarily within the Democratic Party recently? I mean, you'd think, to read and listen to the reports, you'd think that Joe Biden lost in a landslide and the Republicans just triumphed. And on the other hand, I've seen, perhaps it's because Trump is still in office, I've seen remarkably little soul-searching and debates about the future of the Republican Party.
I think on the Republican side, I think it's interesting because nobody wants to be the sort of the major voice in the Republican Party who comes out and says Trump's gone, because the whole movement is so wrapped up in Trump and his sort of war against the establishment that anybody who's seen to be betraying the cause now feels they'll be eaten alive. So you have a lot of sort of Republicans sitting quietly, a lot of sort of behind the scenes work going on, trying to sort of shift him out of office. You often, people are talking about how Laura Ingram's show now, they're on Fox, it's often said that that's sort of talking to Trump directly. And one of the things they're saying is, he may be ruining his legacy if he doesn't accept defeat now. Or like they're just basically trying to say to Trump, please just go with some dignity and then we can try and save your legacy. On the Democratic side, it's odd. I mean, there obviously are going to be tensions between the left of the party and the centrists, and Biden is just a almost monstrously centrist human being. I mean, if you look at his new incoming cabinet, the left is being frozen out, and they're going to be resentful. It's going to be a lot like perhaps with Corbyn and the Labour Party, where Keir Starmer comes in, tries to establish a sort of sense of decency and order and so on. And yet there'll be a lot of discontent on the side. And discontent in victory sometimes is worse than discontent on the side, because Starmer can always say, with Labour, can say, well, look, Corbyn got absolutely destroyed in the election. Biden now can claim to have assembled a winning coalition. And so for a certain amount of time, he can tell the left to be quiet and to bugger off, if I may say that. And but I don't know. I think the party now, the energy in the party, the base is to the left of where Biden is. They're going to get unhappy very quickly. And I think foreign policy may be an area in which they get unhappy very quickly, because the Biden presidency, the sort of team around him, they're very internationalist in outlook. They're already talking about Ethiopia a lot, the crisis in Ethiopia. I think you're going to see that as probably an early flashpoint in the Biden administration's sort of international approach. And, you know, to what extent will they be able to sell a humanitarian war in Ethiopia, say, I'm just speculating here, obviously, but to the left of the party? And to what extent do the left of the party say, well, hang on a second, you know, the Bernie bros, the Bernie Sanders people, to what extent do they say, well, hang on a second, we've done a lot of these foreign wars, we'd be better off with Trump because at least he wasn't a big enthusiast for endless war?
It's quite cynical, but we have essentially gone from Trump, whatever you think of him, to the status quo that led us to Trump. So what do you think we can expect from the next 4, and even I can ask this as well, whether you think Biden would even make it through the first administration, or if he would run for a second administration, and what we should expect in general from a Biden presidency?
I don't think, my bet would be he wouldn't make it to a second administration. He might just stagger on through the first 4 years. Depends how it goes, I suppose. I think in terms of what to expect, it is exactly as you say. It's the status quo ante. They'll try to return Washington to its pre-Trump settings. Interesting thing, and it's sort of testament to Trump's failure, perhaps, as a leader, is that it's quite easy for these people to just resume where they left off. You know, Trump's Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, just set up a lobbying shop. You're not allowed to call it a lobbying shop. It's supposed to be a consulting shop, but it's a lobbying shop, effectively, a foreign policy lobbying shop, just down the road from the White House, to get sort of defense contracts with a view to them returning back to power. Obviously, I mean, that's not conspiracy theory. It's just obviously true. And so these guys just sort of breeze back into power, and you get the blob as it's called, or the swamp as Trump called it. And the swamp is back. So you're just going to see, I think, a very similar administration in terms of a lot of sort of cant, I'd say. I mean, that sounds a bit more hostile than I mean it to, but there's a lot of sort of public, it is cant. It's just, you know, talking about how virtuous they are. And you see this a lot on Twitter. It's very infuriating for people like me to see all these people congratulating themselves on being such great human beings all the time. And I think you will have a lot of that. I think there was an interesting headline in the Washington Post recently where they said that the Washington aristocracy is going to make schmoozing great again. And then the editors changed aristocracy to establishment. But as I put in the piece this week in the Spectator, I think aristocracy is a more accurate word in a way. You know, you are seeing the blue bloods of elite America resuming what they see as their rightful place at the top of the American system.
What do you think Trump will do next? Do you think he'll, even outside the White House, he'll have an enormous amount of influence on the Republican Party? He'll be kingmaker, and he may even jump into the race in 2024. Would he start his own TV show? Would he re-enter electoral politics? And even if he completely steps back, stays out of it, what do you think the future holds for Trumpism, his kind of mixture of America first, isolationism, protectionism, patriotism, nationalism, whatever you want to call it, that kind of strand of politics, which now seems to have cemented itself in the GOP?
Well, I think to answer that question, we've got to think first about what the Biden administration will do. And I think if they have learned anything from the last 4 years, they may be able to mitigate what the response to them is, but from a Republican opposition. I mean, I suspect probably not. I think a lot of these people still think in post-Cold War terms about, you know, the role of America in the world, and that values and foreign policy are the same thing. And then in terms of domestic policy, I mean, will Biden seem to steal a bit of Trump's America First rhetoric, certainly, and perhaps a little bit in his policy proposals? You know, will the working class or the white working class who went back to Biden, as a few of them did in a few counties, Will they feel listened to? I suspect not. I think perhaps the real problem for America is that a lot of these people are just so angry with the system, nothing will placate them. So they'll always vote for the opposition. And so that leads me on to what's next for Trump. I think, again, I'm sorry to keep referring to my pieces, but I mentioned that in a diary piece I did that I had a drink with Nigel Farage the day after the election in the Trump hotel. He was sort of quite flat and depressed, but he was very talkative about Trump. And he said he's definitely going to run in 2024, and he knows Trump quite well. They're friends. He said he has absolutely no doubt about that. And I said, don't you think he's going to start a TV network? And he said, well, why can't he do both? And I think that's true. He's very much a have your cake and eat it type person. So I suspect they will try and, I mean, there's been a lot of agitating against Fox because Fox News has been seen to have betrayed the right because they declared Arizona very early. And there's a sort of feeling that Fox hasn't supported the president, the insurgent right in its hour of need. And so I wonder whether, I mean, Newsmax has been doing very well recently, so has OAN. I think you'll probably see some kind of attempt to form a big right-wing media group, whether Trump has his name on it, which he normally likes to do, likes to put his name on stuff. We'll see. And then, of course, that will drive his movement. But the thing that the sort of Trumpists have to acknowledge is that the movement in itself is not enough to win an election. The movement might get you 30, 40% of the vote. But is it going to be able to win a presidential election? It depends, I suppose, how Biden's administration goes. But I think at the moment, with the sort of current dynamics of American politics, I don't think sort of pure Trumpism wins. I think you need something else to happen. You need some other faction or coalition. And again, it could be this growing multiracial working class coalition. But will that be ripe in 4 years? I don't know.
What do you think the future or the end of the Trump presidency spells for the future more broadly of geopolitics? Do you think that Trump's reluctance to stand by allies has led to maybe a permanent change in mindset that America just can't be relied upon on the world stage anymore, maybe fueling European strategic autonomy, as some in the EU like to call it? Do you think that Biden will just undo everything Trump has done on the world stage in terms of recommitting to all these international institutions and treaties? And what about his attitude to China, which he's called a competitor rather than an adversary?
China is the big question. Obviously, there's going to be great suspicion among a lot of people, not just people on the right, but also a lot of Democrats, that Biden is a sellout to China. There are sort of obviously dirty allegations that he is personally compromised on China, that his family is. But I think China is the big foreign policy question for all Americans. You will obviously see a less antagonistic approach, but they will try and make out that while we're sort of civil, Democrats make out while we're sort of civil with China, we're actually very tough, whereas Trump was rude, but actually rolled over. That's the sort of line from the Democrats. I don't think it's quite true, and I don't think it will play out to be that true. I think you will see a sort of softer approach to China with a lot of tough talk about the South Pacific and more talk about an Asian pivot, which was a big thing in the Obama administration. I think if they were smart, they would try and adopt some foreign policy positions that would make them seem different to what's come before, to make them seem different to the pre-2016 world. So, for instance, Trump has gone a long way towards removing troops from Afghanistan. He nearly did it just before his departure in January, we assume. But there's still a sort of minimal force will be left after January 15th, I think it is. And it would be very interesting to see if the Democrats just say, oh, no, well, we're back in charge now. We're going to carry on nation building in Afghanistan for another 20 years. That is a hugely unpopular position in America. I mean, hugely is perhaps a little bit of exaggeration, because Americans just don't think about foreign policy as much as we think they do. But it's certainly not a winning position in an election. So do they commit endless money and perhaps American lives in the future in Afghanistan, or do they try and do something unpredictable? I suspect they're not smart enough to do that, but maybe I'm wrong. They have just won an election after all.
Thank you so much for talking to me today. And yeah, goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you.